title is The Secret History of the War on Drugs, and the reason that I say secret is that most of this is not necessarily kept secret, but it's not known. And in fact, it's one of those topics that we kind of live under a mythology with. So we tend to think that, drugs are bad and only, bad people use them, and the only people who go to, prison for it are, the worst of the worst. And these are some of the lines that the ONDCP, the Office of National Drug Control Policy, goes around the country telling people, we don't send people to prison for drug possession, we don't do this, we don't do that, we're not involved, we're just trying to help, right? So the reality is that the war on drugs isn't going anywhere anytime soon. It's socially, politically, and economically enmeshed into our society. It produces millions of public and private sector jobs in direct and related industries that post revenues somewhere on the order of hundreds of billions of dollars every year. The drug trade itself exists on the same level as the trade in oil, which is about $500 billion to $750 billion every year. Most of this money gets invested into the American financial system, right? Our banks, our stocks, our real estate. They have a figure that they believe between 1991 and 2001, somewhere between $2.5 and $5 trillion in drug money was laundered through the Western banking system. So it's not any stretch to claim that the U.S. economy is dependent to a large extent upon drug money. In fact, it can be argued that we profit from the war on drugs and the drug trade more than any other nation. The war on drugs has become a cornerstone of our foreign policy, our national security strategy. It's also a cornerstone of the culture war here in this country. And it's a key component of racial and socioeconomic injustice, social control, and a means for government intervention into the private lives of their citizens. And when you look at it, it's almost as if they planned it that way. And I'd like to kind of show you how. In this presentation, I'm going to show a few things throughout the course of the next couple of hours. First is that the war on drugs is a historical tool of colonial expansion. It is the main facilitator of covert action, in which the primary culprits involved are the U.S. intelligence community and the U.S. defense community. The war on drugs is also a multi-level economic engine. There is, as I mentioned, the drug money that flows through the Western financial system. There is this idea of a replacement economy, which I'll get into a little bit later. There is budgets, bureaus, and jobs in local, state, municipal, county, and federal law enforcement. And then there's also what's known as the prison, industrial, or the correctional complex, which is prisons and jails and probation officers and monitoring equipment and all kinds of things like that. The war on drugs is also a tool of social control. And it was turned into a real war as a stepping stone measure or a stopgap measure between the Cold War and the war on terror. It was a means to keep high defense appropriations and to keep continuity with what's known as the national security state, which is what we live under now and have since 1947. I'll get into that later. So what is the war on drugs, right? If you were to ask people like, well, it's the fight against, illegal drug use and the danger that it does to our culture, except that when you look at it from a historical context, you realize that that's really not necessarily true. It is partially true in the sense that there are efforts to try to attack the illegal drug trade, but why they're there are entirely, it's not exactly clear to most people. And in fact, the reason and the motives behind it are actually much more nefarious than we've ever been really led to believe. But the way that I like to frame this is that it's what we call a problem, reaction, solution paradigm. Problem, reaction, solution. Okay. This is a common way of controlling a large body, a population, a society, any type of group. What happens in this is that in the first step, the government or the ruling body creates and or exploits a problem that already exists and then blames it on others. So they will, for example, pull off a terrorist attack and then blame it on their enemies. Right? The media then becomes complicit in this by repeating the fake story over and over and over again without challenging it, so that it's hammered into public consciousness. As a result of this act that has either been created or exploited, the people then react by asking the government for help. They say, make us safe. And they're willing to give up rights, and they're willing to give up freedoms in order to become safe or become more secure. So oftentimes this exchange of security for freedom happens through fear, whether it's manufactured or whether it's real. And then the government body will step in and they will offer a solution that in many cases was planned well before the crisis. Don't worry, we'll take care of you, we got it all solved. What we're going to do is X, Y, and Z. And generally the solution is always more centralized control in the state or the ruling body. So in the case of the war on drugs, problem, reaction, solution paradigm is used in order to advance three separate fields of interest. The first is our foreign policy and our geostrategic alliances around the world. The second is our domestic politics and policy and our economic system. And the third is the social and political control of targeted communities. I'm going to go into each one of these in a lot more detail. But first, I just wanted to give you a quick overview of the history of the drug trade so we kind of understand where all of this is coming from. Okay? It didn't just kind of pop out of the blue in the last few years. It's helpful to understand and frame this issue with the understanding that all empires since the Renaissance, including ours, has been driven by the need for greater and greater amounts of natural resources in order to maintain the economic system that's set up in the empire. This is most often found in overseas colonies, and more to the point, nearly all of these empires have used drugs as a cheap way to pay for colonial expansion. Okay. The next series of points I'm going to go through come from a book called The Politics of Heroin by Alfred P. McCoy. It was a landmark book, it came out in 1971. I also list sources later, so I have an extensive list that you can look at how I got here. McCoy basically identifies three broad periods in the illicit drug trade. And this is mostly focusing on opium because cocaine is a relatively new drug in comparison. Coke has been around forever, but the actual alkaline of cocaine is relatively new. So alcohol and opium were essentially the great vices that got peddled for a few thousand years. The first phase of the illegal drug trade happened from about 2000 BC until about 1800 AD. And this is when opium was primarily medicinal, it was primarily based in the Mediterranean, and it was traded across the Asian landmass. And it reached China by about 1000 AD. It turns up in pharmacopoeia, different types of medicines, from Greece to China throughout that whole 3,000 year period. In the 16th century, the Dutch East India Company began trading opium in India, and they would grow it and cultivate it there, and they would take it through Southeast Asia into China. And they were the first to set up a transnational trade with it. Beginning in the 18th century, the British moved the Dutch out of the way and kind of took over the opium trade. They established a monopoly on production. They produced it in the Bengal region of northeast India. And then they would run annual opium auctions. They would sail from Calcutta into Canton, China, and they would smuggle all the opium into China, where it remained legal. Because of this, and to maintain this system, and to force open China and the East to the Western markets, Britain fought two wars in 1840 and 1858, the Opium Wars. It was essentially a war to keep the Chinese people addicted to opium. They didn't want to do it anymore. They made it illegal, so the British decided to go and shell them until they decided to make it legal again. The latter half of the 1800s sees a huge marked increase in opium use. The French, the Spanish, the Portuguese empires all traffic opium. The French did it through Southeast Asia, the Spanish did it through the Philippines, and the Portuguese did it through Macau.